I want to give you an example of a friend of mine, just so you can see how many layers he had to dig through to recognize what was going on inside him. He's already in his 50s now. His parents immigrated to Europe in the 60s. His father couldn't read or write. When my friend was about 6 or 7 years old, just in the 2nd grade, his father started calling him regularly to read him letters that the father himself couldn't read. These letters were exclusively from public authorities or the father's employer. And you can imagine how these letters were structured. The boy would always look at these letters and feel completely overwhelmed, not knowing where to begin reading. At the top left was the recipient, on the right the sender, and the letter always began with "Dear Sir" or "Madam." Just at the sight of these letters, the boy would experience an inner shock and be paralyzed, since he knew what was about to happen. He was already familiar with the process and his whole body was activated. The father repeated this ritual over and over again. Regularly, he would call his son screaming, telling him to read the letter to him, knowing that the boy would never be able to do so. Later on, the boy would often wonder why his father even called him. When the boy stood before him with wide eyes, the father never gave him more than 10 seconds. As soon as the father saw that the boy was just as clueless as he was, he would immediately start to rage, yell loudly, and hit the boy, screaming at him and saying, "Do you go to school or to the toilet?" This was very humiliating for this little kid. During the attempt to read, the boy always positioned himself in a way that he could react quickly and run away within seconds. He could never look directly into his father's eyes, but he always watched him from the corner of his eye, waiting for the father to start yelling and hitting him. And that outburst would definitely come. He would always instinctively dodge and flee to another room. This way, the boy was always prepared to flee because he knew he would never be able to read the letter. Never. After a time, the boy had the impression that it should be his duty to be able to read. Since he goes to school, but he himself was so stuck in this situation, not knowing how he can help himself. Now, let me break this down for you. Since then, this boy has had a very hard time learning anything at all, because he immediately gets dizzy when faced with an intellectual challenge. He always gets panic attacks. He always has to make many attempts to understand something because he feels like a failure and that the roof is about to collapse on him. As an adult, and after many discussions, we found out that it was precisely this ritualistic witch hunt with his father that was to blame. Of course, it's more of a combination of many things, but the ritualistic humiliation by the father is a significant part of it. We worked out that the father himself was completely overwhelmed by the situation of not being able to read and being completely dependent on the other people to read to him. This powerlessness, shame, and also anger at not being able to do this, coupled with the inner pain of failing, this feeling he simply projected onto his son. The father basically needed the son to not feel his own humiliation and to blame someone else. The son, on the other hand, regularly saw how the father made several attempts to learn to read, but always without success, and the father was always completely desperate that he couldn't read, but he never admitted it. Because his father called him, there were two situations for the boy. On the one hand, as a child, the boy felt he had to save his father from this unhappy situation. Deep inside him, the son took on this responsibility. After all, he belonged to the family. On the other hand, it would have been an opportunity for the son in the parents' house to finally enjoy the recognition he needed, because the boy was often left to his own devices. This unattainable goal, official letters which were often several pages long and cluttered with legal paragraphs, this boy could never read this, let alone convey to his father in an understandable way. With this mission, the son regularly stormed to his father, hoping to eventually succeed and arouse enthusiasm as a prodigy. Unfortunately, the boy never succeeded. Unconsciously, it would not have been in the father's interest for the son to be better than the father anyway. The father simply needed a scapegoat, and this, of course, unconsciously. Most fathers don't want to harm their children. They just don't realize that they're passing on their own story. The result is that this boy had problems learning for years, and when he achieved something, he's now an engineer, it was never satisfying. Exactly this is the paradox. He always had goals that are unattainable, and when he reached something, it didn't give him satisfaction. Either he always wanted to be the smartest, or the strongest, or the most beautiful. Due to the unbearable pain, the boy has begun to partially split off from himself, and has thus created a system that supports him in at least partially numbing or pushing away the pain of this humiliation. Let me just briefly explain what I mean with system. In many cases, people try to get rid of feelings they don't want to experience. They simply declare a part of themselves dead and mentally separate from the pain. This essentially means they are disconnecting from a part of themselves. The unconsciousness then takes responsibility, but not without compensation. Since you are the one who is alive, you must also give up a part of your life energy so that your unconsciousness can do you this favor. Thus, a system is created within yourself that becomes autonomous over time, taking on both the task of burying your pain and punishing you on behalf of your father. Yes, you heard me correctly. This system is very intelligent. It knows that your father can only feel superior and be the person he wants to be if you continue to show him that you are the victim. For this reason, you must radiate humility. Indeed, the father needs someone inferior to feel superior himself. The system ensures this by controlling you in a way that keeps you as a perpetual victim, such as making foolish mistakes that must be punished. Don't forget that being loved or being punished are both emotionally very intense. Yes, one is negative and the other positive, but nevertheless, subconsciously, it is also a very strong bond, albeit negative, that the boy builds up with his father, and every child needs a bond. The father's punishment has been internalized by the boy, and this can only be achieved by partially splitting oneself and transferring part of one's own responsibility, power and energy to this split off part. Thus, the boy can partially let go and not constantly dwell on it, while the split off part buries it and demands regular pain, resulting in an energy loss. I know this sounds very disturbing, but we humans are more than just flesh and bones. So coming back to the system, this system or his inner mechanism which emerged from this childhood made a contract with his father, which he unconsciously and mentally signed, which says, "Oh my father, I am responsible for your powerlessness and I am willing to take over your pain. I will be the instrument through which you will liberate yourself and I will relieve you of your humiliation." I want you to imagine what this contract has done with the boy, and the worst, it's totally unconscious. You won't recognize what you did, you will only feel it. You can sense at the highest level that something seems to be constantly fighting against you. Everyone can relate to it. Very often we stand in our own way. Depending on how hard an event affects us, it can develop into minimal or often maximum self-sabotage and self-punishment mechanisms. Being alone without any help or understanding about the own situation, it's really hard to see through these layers and dimensions. As I mentioned before, as the boy grew up, he was never satisfied with what he had achieved. He was very disoriented, not knowing what kind of goal he should look for now. The inner system of the boy simply shifted the goalpost, always to make sure that he did not achieve his goal yet, because, don't forget, the contract is still valid. Actually, it was never about the goal. This is the irony. It was about the unattainable. Because as a child, he knew exactly that he was standing before an overwhelming high iron wall when it came to reading the letters of his father, where he didn't even know where to start. As soon as he had the letters in front of him, an awe-inspiring powerlessness immediately came over him. Internally, all lights went out. And exactly this feeling he fought against his whole life. So it's not about him achieving or defeating anything. On the contrary, the boy took the unattainable and invincible as his opponent, in the paradoxical hope that he would run a marathon into eternity. Think about it. This means the aim was never to win, but to see it as a solution nonetheless, because this is the only way he can get closer to his father. As an adult, he learned through several therapies and discussions with good and knowledgeable people that he had to change his perspective. He has to tell himself, his inner child, that he has no responsibility to read the letters for his father and doesn't have to take it on anymore. The father simply made a mistake and it was just unfair and not child appropriate. He doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to take on his father's powerlessness. He doesn't have to get stuck in that childhood anymore and play the role of the powerless one. The only thing the boy has to do is to terminate the contract. This is the key. The son had to play the role of the powerless one for the father. It wasn't about reading the letter. You have to understand this. It was about saving the father by taking away his powerlessness and taking over the unpleasant part of his father's life. The irony is that indeed the son saved the father, because without the son, the father would not be able to bear his own pain. Alone, the father was like a baby. Also, one part was about playing the father and adapting the hopelessness in order to support the father in a humiliating attitude. At first glance, this seems irritating, but children reflect their parents and protectively take over everything from them, however contradictory and strange it may seem. So, I ask you to get out of the fight, even if you don't understand it in the current situation. What I mean by struggle or fight is simply that one should not endlessly fight against their own feelings internally. One should not try to suppress them. The constant rumination, the constant internal battle against something, is always a distortion of one's own life energy. I know it's not easy, and I don't mean that you should implement it immediately, or that you can do it already. I just want to theoretically prepare you and make you aware of it in the first step. Because you have to experience that actually your bad feelings and emotions can lead you to the solution you were looking for. Your subconsciousness wants to tell you something, but you are translating it as fear, anger, or shame. You have to be aware of it first, then recognize it, then accept it, and regularly bring it into your consciousness. And only then will your whole being slowly but surely make friends with this rediscovery. Because you didn't start fighting against your feelings, thoughts, and emotions since birth. You must have started at some point. Your consciousness can also remember your beautiful and healthy times very well. You just need to reactivate it. So take your time and try to come out of the struggle again and again to recognize the truth behind the negative emotions. Start to see your negative emotions, the system, who seems to be your opponent, which he is not. I can guarantee you that for sure. Start to see this system as someone you want to come closer to. Because one thing I can tell you, as sad as it may sound, as soon as you take the first step towards an inner fight or to the opponent inside you, you have lost.